The first thing that struck me, coming through Harlem, surrounded by Harlemites, my folks, and then entering the college and finding there weren't any of my folks.
We had to have a strategy on how to open the doors for more people like us.
Black and Puerto Rican students chained the gates to City College of New York, closing it.
We shall be free, yeah.
We shall be free. Everybody gonna get together and walk like you and me.
We shall be free, yeah.
We shall be free.
So power to the people, power.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. You just viewed the trailer for The Five Demands, a film by Greta Schiller and Andrea Weiss. My name is Julie Wang, and I'm with DocuSeek, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to join today's exciting virtual panel discussion on equity, access, discrimination, and race in higher education. Before I hand this off to our moderator for today, Vanessa Valdez, the Associate Provost for Community Engagement at the City College of New York, I want to go over a few items. Everyone is automatically muted during this webinar. We also encourage you to use the chat or Q&A functions throughout the discussion, and we will address as many questions as we can towards the end. If you would like to speak your question, you can just raise your hand and we will unmute you during the Q&A section. We'll also share a link to this recording. And finally, if you would like more information on how to access the Five Demands at your institution, you can visit the DocuSeek website or the Five Demands website, and we will show the URL for both websites at the end. And now I'll hand this over to Vanessa, our moderator for today.
There we go. Hi. My name is Vanessa Valdez. As Julie said, we are going to bring up our colleagues, Doctors Ramirez, Rooks, and Warren. I will invite them to be on camera in a second. Thank you all for joining us this Wednesday. It is my absolute pleasure not only to serve as the Associate Provost here at the City College of New York, the site of the Five Demands and that takeover in April of 1969, but also, you know, for many people who know the history of the City University of New York, City College, born as the Free Academy in 1847, was the first experiment in democracy in terms of a school founded explicitly in a secular manner to educate the children of the City of New York. So with that, yes, there's one. We're going to be popping up shortly. There we go. Here we go. And so, colleagues, oh mine, I ask that you introduce yourselves in alphabetical order, please, starting with Dr. Ramirez.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mario Ramirez, and I'm Associate Dean and Chief Librarian of the City College Libraries, and I'm happy to be here.
Dr. Rooks.
Hi, my name is Noliwe Rooks, and I'm the chair and a professor at Brown University in the Department of Africana Studies.
Thank you. Dr. Warren.
Hello, everyone. My name is Mark Warren. I'm a professor of public policy and public affairs at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, and I am co-founder of an organization called the People's Think Tank on Educational Justice.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank each of you for being here. I thank our colleagues at DocuSeek for organizing this. I thank Andrea Weiss and everyone at Jezebel Productions for creating this this documentary and for educating a lot of people about what happens here at City College. So just to orient everyone, you know, you see the title of the documentary is The Five Demands. I just want to quickly go over what those demands were, what these young people were asking for or demanding in 1969. They wanted a school of Black and Puerto Rican studies that would be controlled by the community, students, and faculty. They wanted a freshman orientation specifically for Black and Puerto Rican students. They asked that the SEEK program, the Searching for Education and Elevation and Knowledge program, and we could talk about that in a second, would have a determining voice in the setting of guidelines for the SEEK program, including the hiring and firing of personnel. The fourth was that the racial composition of the entering freshman class could be racially reflective of the high school population of the city of New York. And finally, that all education majors, i.e. those here who are majoring in education at the City College of New York, be required to take Black and Puerto Rican studies, Black and Puerto Rican history and Spanish language, so as to better serve their students. And so those were the 5 demands. And so with that, I'd like to just ask as an opening question to our panel, what did you know about this history prior to viewing the documentary? Is it common history, even from your fields? I love the fact that all of you each introduced yourselves in your titles. So did you know of this history prior to viewing this documentary? And based on that, what does that say or not say about where we are in 2024? And if we could just do just a regular round robin at the beginning of this, alphabetically, and then I promise I'll switch it up.
So I'm happy to start to kick us off. I'm very new to City College. I've only been here a little less than a year. And so I would say that I didn't know some of the specifics of the sort of the history on this particular campus. And so seeing the film was not only extraordinarily enlightening, but also sort of reaffirmed I think the importance of documentation, not only documenting BIPOC communities in New York City and beyond, but also moreover sort of documenting social justice movements in New York City and the participation of BIPOC communities, individuals in those things. But I do have a past history as a project archivist at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies here in New York City at Hunter College. And so there are sort of bits and pieces of this history that I was familiar with, not in so far as how it manifested itself at City College, but definitely in terms of like a lot of the contributions of particularly Puerto Rican communities to really radicalizing history and really changing not only history, but I'm saying education in many respects, and trying to advocate for changes in the education system, particularly in the teaching of Spanish in K through 12 schools, and also making sure that university educations were also like not only open to Puerto Rican and Black communities in New York City, but also moreover that taught their histories in many respects, right? And sort of respect their histories and contributions to sort of the fabric of New York history, because, oftentimes, as we all know, those are not sort of well represented in many of our sort of classrooms and our history books and our texts. But also moreover, it doesn't account for, at least for the Puerto Rican community in particular that I'm more familiar with, sort of the extensive contributions that they've made to New York City history and how far back it goes, right? That it's not sort of really isolated to a very specific period. And so it, as I said, noted earlier, I didn't know the specifics of how these things manifested themselves at City College, but certainly I was aware of how a lot of these sort of social justice movements and movements for better forms of education and much more historical representation sort of manifested themselves in the Puerto Rican community in New York City in particular. So
thank you. No way.
Hi, I think I'm next. I thank you all for having me. It's great to be here in conversation with my panelists and with all the folks who took the time in the middle of a beautiful day, at least here, to join us. I am this is a period that I study in terms of educational justice and access, and specifically around how student protests in the 60s and 70s really coalesced around a demand for a demonstration of what educational democracy could look like, and connecting that demand to more robust forms of democracy. These were from middle school and high school students, most specifically around the country, Puerto Rican and Black, and Chicano if you're out on the West Coast. But those are the communities that really but it starts in the 40s, but really most dramatically in the 60s and 70s, who are coming together and demanding representation in middle schools, demanding teachers in middle schools and high schools who speak their language, who know they have a history that doesn't start with oppression, who understand that there are freedom fighters and writers and poets, historians, sociologists, and just folks who sat around tables and dissected power in ways that trained academics could only hope to fully understand. So this was a period that I'm very familiar with. It's a period that the founding of Black studies and Latinx studies comes out of because you had young people who truly believed that this was a period globally. And I think it's important, we're going to focus on City University and the five demands in this extraordinary opening and founding of a vision and institutionalization of a vision. But globally, you have young people in Cuba, in Soweto, in Brazil, who are saying we want a different future, and education for them is central, and being seen and being heard, and being taught a fuller vision of humanity is central for all of them. So it's a really exciting period that I wish more people would study. I think it really gives us some insight into what is required to bring our freedom dreams into reality. What's required, the kinds of linkages, the kinds of strategies, the kinds of commitment, again, that went from middle school up through colleges, but CUNY in particular, the demands were for an entire institution, a publicly funded institution of higher education that would in and of itself not make a Black studies program possible, a Puerto Rican studies program possible, but a school that was going to, with taxpayer dollars and support, educate all of the folks that you need to have educated if you're ever going to have democracy be real. And that is unique about what happened, and the success of what happened, and the change in the student body and the legacy of it. It stands alone, but there's a larger context that I think it's consistently in dialogue with.
Thank you. Thank you for all of that. Mark.
Yeah, so thank you again for inviting me here, and really honored to be with my colleagues on this panel and thinking about their comments. I'm someone who studies and works with contemporary movements for educational justice, mostly in also African American, Black communities, Puerto Rican, Chicano, Brown communities across the country. I work, for example, a lot with young people who are organizing to demand the removal of policing from their schools, public schools in this country. Challenging the school to prison pipeline, which is, of course, preventing young people from even getting the opportunity to get to college. Concentrated again, mostly Black and Brown young men, also women. And, young people often talk about, and we often talk about the movement today being, the contemporary version or built on the backs of an earlier racial and educational justice movement. And while that is true, and I knew something about the strike at CCNY, I didn't know much about it. And I think we continue to remain a little bit disconnected historically from those important movements. And that's one of the things that, I try to work with young people, and also many themselves and many organizers do, trying to educate and help young people understand the history of the movement that they are building upon. And one of the things that really, there are a couple of things that struck me about this film and the strike that I think is so important is, first of all, how much young people really were at the forefront of the struggles to transform our educational systems, whether in K through 12 or in higher education, towards racial justice, inclusiveness, really trying to transform those institutions towards democracy. And how much those young people were not just organizing in schools, but I think this film really shows just how connected the folks who are on strike at CCNY were with the larger Black Power movement or Puerto Rican liberation movement that was going on at the time. The struggle to transform our institutions of education are not disconnected from the broader racial justice movement. And I think this film really shows that. And, it's what has just been said, in the sense that education, in many ways, the demand for education is really central to liberation and part of the liberation of communities. And so I think this film really shows that. And the second thing that I think is really, I think stands out from this film, which I think is really relevant for today, is really the need for direct action. And it's often fine to say, oh, it's great that young people or whoever did, sat in on lunch counter sit-ins or occupied buildings 50 years ago in some other place. But when young people organize to, sit in today or to protest or to demand the removal of police from schools, then that can oftentimes be seen as a different kind of story. And I think it really gives us the lesson that change really comes importantly from the direct action and mobilization of young people and African American communities, Latino communities, but also some of the white allies that we saw featured in the film as well, that there was a larger movement at hand here that had a broader vision for their own institution that really mattered so much in their lives and the lives of other young people, but what its importance could be in a bigger struggle to transform American society towards, democracy and community liberation.
I really thank you for reminding us that when we're talking about this, it's true. Like there seems to be a kind of patina that glosses over disruption, right? Like in the moment, we know that it's disruptive. That's the purpose of it, right? But we tend to glorify it depending on where we're viewing. I want to start off, I want to go back to what Noliwe talked about in terms of the role of education, public education in particular, and democracy. And I'm going to ask Alex to please play the first clip from the movie.
I grew up very poor and very working class. And the schools, they didn't know what to do with us. I wasn't really taught how to read, how to write, and they had specific programs where they tracked us into. So the program I was into was to be a nurse's aide, learn how to take care of people. So I didn't even think about going to college.
You weren't left out of college because you were dumb or because you couldn't learn. You were left out because the way society is structured, okay? And you weren't structured into that process.
It's actually quite un-American. You have people who've been here for 400 years. They are paying the same taxes, they're riding the same subway, and they have the same dreams for their children, which is to be well educated, to be well spoken, to be in a career of their choice and not forced to do menial tasks for everyone else.
Now sit down, Sharon, and okay, now what do you do?
In the 50s and even in the 60s, in predominantly Black and Puerto Rican schools, the curriculum was very soft and the books were very old. The teachers were newly minted coming out of college, who had the most inexperienced teachers teaching in the ghetto schools.
Get over there and sit down. Sit down. Wait. 5, 10, 20, 25, 30. It's 35 sitting. Everybody.
So for someone to say that Black and brown people are arriving at CCNY without a proper foundation, who caused that to be? Who kept that in place?
Thank you. Nolia, I want to start with you and just perhaps respond to anything you just saw in that clip, whether it be about, teacher preparation at the time, teacher preparation in urban schools, right? And someone in the chat asked, Roberta, I believe that you asked about if the current student population reflects New York City. I just want to set the scene. New York City at the time was, or rather, the New York City public school system at the time, and certainly here in Harlem, right, was about, let's say 95, 6, 7% Black and Puerto Rican. City colleges percentage at the time was about 5% Black and Puerto Rican. That's what those students were fighting for. Was why does this school that is still, this campus is on 137th Street between Convent Avenue, between Amsterdam Avenue and St. Nicholas Terrace. This school is in Harlem. Why did this school in particular not reflect our surrounding neighborhood? So just wanted to set that up. And yes, currently the statistics of the City College of New York, all of the City University of New York, all 25 campuses are minority serving institutions. This school is a Hispanic serving institution, as most of our schools are. If they are either HSI, Hispanic serving institutions, predominantly Black institutions, some of which are Asian American, Pacific Islander institutions. So meaning like the percentages are more than 25%. Here at City College, we are 32% Hispanic at the moment, 20% Asian, 12% Black, 10% white. And then there's the percentage of remaining 2 or more races. That was not how it was in 1969. So that was a long lead in, no leeway. Thank you for your patience. You're muted, my love.
Here, I was trying to be nice and unmute. Now here I am, like just chatting with it muted. Here, I actually believe that there's a universe where you can look at the history of education in the United States specifically as a history that comes up with new and innovative ways to undereducate non-white children. There are few periods in the history of the nation from the founding. I mean, if I date the founding of public education in the US in many ways to the indigenous boarding schools, where you're the federal government that comes along and it's sort of like, we're going to prescribe a curriculum just for your kids. You parents don't actually have a lot to say. We're going to come and get your kids and take them and put them somewhere and then tell them to cut their hair and not speak their language and behave in the ways that we think that they should behave. In many ways, in terms of the education of non-white, non-wealthy, non-high status people, that is the framing that you can carry through the history of this nation. You don't have, it is almost impossible, I've looked, to find images of classrooms with white children in them that look anything like what we just saw. You can actually find a lot of historical images and data that look like what we saw that may have Latinx kids in them, may have Asian kids, depending on where you are, what period of time you're in, and how high the wall of anti-Asian sentiment is. You can actually find a lot. You still struggle, I think, today to find some groups of Asians that are welcomed into a lot of predominantly white institutions, such as Filipinos, such as Vietnamese, Asian is a huge category. And when you start to look at higher education, who you're talking about, who's getting in, it's a couple of countries, and usually the higher wealthier, higher status, wealthier kinds of things. So what I would say is, just in general, what I try to disrupt very often is this idea that in the absence of sustained and organized actions on the part of Black and Latinx parents or students themselves, what you have is dysfunction in education. You can find examples where that's not the case. You can find examples where schools are open and bring people in. What I would say is, based on the work that I've done, those examples would be a distinct minority. A majority of certain kinds of people who've been educated in U.S. public schools, again, since the 1700s on, would tell a very different story than the ones we often tell about what education is, what it should be. So in the 60s and 70s, with the larger societal realignments that were taking place globally, but certainly in the United States, specifically around how are we going to make sure that Black and Latinx kids can ascend to a middle class, a solidly middle class kind of lifestyle in those kinds of careers. In schools like the one that I teach in, it's how do they ascend to a leadership class? But the conversation really is, how do we open up strata of society? And how do we use college education in order to benefit people who have not benefited before? And again, consistently, what you will find in the history of this country is, if you do not want your babies educated in classrooms like that clip that we saw, it is on people in those communities to make the claim, to educate those children, to come up with different options and opportunities. And that's really, in a sense, what happened at CUNY. The demand did not come from the top down. It was a bottom up demand. It was a coalitional demand, but it was a demand that was about what taxpayer dollars owe citizens who may not have the money to contribute as much in taxes as others. And that's still something we're working out. Like that's a dichotomy we have not quite solved. I don't think. But we get our marching orders, or we get some potential for what needs to happen, I think, from the clip that you showed.
I thank you for all of that. And I also appreciate that you have posited two different perspectives and two renderings of history, right? Like a perspective that says, whether it's Indigenous boarding schools, whether it's, unfunded schools, schools that continue to be unfunded, and an alternative history which focuses on the communities themselves taking charge of their own education, right? We know in this country, another rendering of the public education can be dated back to the Reconstruction era, where, again, African-American communities said, no, we have to do this because we know they are not going to. So I thank you for that. I also want to thank Greta in the chat who placed the title of Dr. Rooks's work so that everyone can be familiar with our colleagues' work. Mark, I'm going to come to you in a second because you touched on solidarity and Noliwe just also talked about coalitional politics happening when it comes to the involvement of folks in what does it mean to be involved in our democracy, right? And for some people, tax dollars is a direct line to that. What do we, as tax-paying folks, I would say citizens, but again, we know even folks who are not citizens pay into this democracy. So whether we, all of us who pay into this, what does this then owe us? So I'd like to cue up the second clip before we start that conversation.
That was a radical time for white students too. A lot of the white students stood in front to protect us and enable us to continue to be there. So they were our comrades, our allies, and they had our back.
During the strike, my concern was, what in the world's going to happen to our semester? We were careerists. We wanted to make sure the semester continued as it was, because we have our mundane aspirations just to advance ourselves another step further and hopefully someday to be a college professor.
We don't want a small group of troublemakers to take over the campus.
We want the school, the racial composition of the City College of New York to be representative of the high schools of the city of New York, which is 57%.
You can check this with the Board of Ed. 57% of the public school students are Black and Puerto Rican. The thing is that racism is hurting everybody here, and discrimination is hurting all peoples.
Why don't you join the majority?
I am joining the majority of Americans who want a better life in this country.
Well, the majority around you doesn't seem to support that. What does the majority say? That's what the majority says.
The people standing around here are not the majority because
Well, the people certainly are not.
Wow, I think I held my own there. It's funny, I don't remember that. But now seeing it, I feel like, I knew what was important and I stood up. And you notice I don't see any women yelling at me. It all seems to be like it's all these big men like converging on me. So they were not the majority. And even though they said they were, but it's part of history that white men often feel like they are the majority, like what they say is truth. And they try to erase everything else that is said.
Gallagher was having a lot of difficulty with the student protesters. This must have been a very frustrating situation for him.
Thank you. So I want to highlight again, or just from that, pick apart a couple of things that you had said, Mark, and I will turn to both you and Mario with regards to, again, the renderings of history and the archiving of these histories. Mark, you spoke about coalitional politics. You touched on Black Power movement, larger movements, right? I do want to say several of the students that were involved in these protests were also Black Panthers. They were also Young Lords, right? So this wasn't just, oh, their friends were this, like they were City College students right? And so again, a reminder of just the multiple identities that we hold at any given moment. That last 10 seconds you saw Dr. Buell Gallagher, who was the president at the time of the school, he had also been president of an HBCU prior to coming to City College. He had in fact been recruited to come to City College to serve as president of this school, right? And so again, you have a man who is very aware of racial politics at the time. And for those of you who saw the clip or saw the film, the larger film, Dr. Gallagher's decision to not call the NYPD onto this campus allowed for it to survive for 2 weeks. He then, and we can get to that discussion. But again, regarding the role of administration in supporting students or not, a recognition of larger goals. So to both of you, I ask about, and each one, I will not decide who starts. But if you could speak about just what we saw from that clip, what is to be gleaned from that clip in terms of gender politics, racial politics, coalitions, and the recording of these histories.
Did you want to go first, Mario? Go ahead.
Well, I think, and I'm sorry, my light automatically goes out, so I had to step away for a second because otherwise it would be completely dark in here. One of the things that stood out to me in that clip, it was the interview with Naomi Chessman, and at some point in time she mentioned something about, the erasure of histories, right? And so that's only certain people are constructing histories, and typically it was white men in the past who were sort of like inscribing what kind of histories were happening, and therefore sort of compelling an erasure of these, what you termed as alternative histories or sort of concurrent narratives that occur where there are sort of like communities of color in New York City and the United States and beyond who are sort of doing things, right, that oftentimes are forgotten and or deemed as unimportant, and therefore either there's no documentation that exists in order to attest to these movements and or to these kinds of manifestation of like rebellion or radicality, right? Or contributions to community building or sort of critiques of education. And so, and I think what happens is that we they keep sort of, particularly within the realm of education, you keep sort of recreating this or continuously sort of enforcing this presumption of the incompetence of communities of color and of women, right? Because oftentimes you will erase the history of people pushing for change and trying to make change and trying to advocate for more for their communities and for their children. And sometimes that's sort of lost by the wayside and lost to history because of who is inscribing history and who's writing the history books and or determining what, subjects are, worthy of, interest and research at the academic level in many respects, right? So I think that's something that for me, like really sort of popped up in terms of her really identifying in many ways, like sort of the root of the problem in many respects in terms of, us having to recreate the wheel oftentimes because we don't get to sort of know the extent of our histories and the extent to which our sort of forebears have really struggled to make changes and to make change in society and to make things better for us in many respects. So.
Yeah, I could add a few things. First of all, I do think that, if we're looking at, where is the, engine for change to advance anti-racism, it is in the organization and leadership in communities of color, as we saw in this film, that it was really the Black students, the Puerto Rican students who really led this fight. But at the same time, I think whenever that does occur, in this country, there is also the mobilization of white people who come forward as allies to that movement, and that is also a history that is not taught and is often erased, going back to white abolitionists. And it's not there's a troubled history in terms of dynamics around these kinds of coalitions and white issues of white privilege within that, but nevertheless. And I think, as is seen in this film, the support of white students was seen as very important, and also just the position of white administrators who might be more open or at least less hostile to these demands is also important. And I think, going back to what Dr. Rooks was saying earlier, as a result of the mobilizations in the 60s, we did have a period where education did improve for many Black and brown children in this country. And even though I don't like to go by test results only, the so-called gap in test scores really closed in the 1970s. There was a large expansion of access by Black and brown students into higher education. But we also then saw the backlash, right? And we saw an organized effort to mobilize white people and often white men like myself to oppose those demands, whether that was affirmative action. And that started in the 70s. I mean, we're seeing this reach a peak right now with the Supreme Court decisions, but some of the early decisions that started to dismantle affirmative action, including the Bakke case, go back all the way to the 70s, right at the beginning of this progress. So I guess what I'm trying to suggest is that it's also a political struggle. Like, what happens in our educational system is a deeply political issue about the structure of the society and the racial hierarchies and the class hierarchies that that do benefit many people and some people, but there are white people who come to see that their cause is a common one with people of color, and whether that's about morally what is right and wrong, whether that's about the kind of society that we want to live in, whether that's about a belief in democracy, whether that's about the economic future of this country as the population really changes demographically. I think there's a number of reasons that move white people into action, and it should not lead the struggle, but it is, if we're really going to have the kind of transformation that occurs in a wholesale investment in public education and a change in moving it away from the kinds of cultural and educational philosophies that Dr. Rooks was talking about, that I think feature white culture and European culture, we're going to need a broad-based movement that includes white allies. And I think we can learn from this film, and we can see it in the contemporary support that was given, at least for a while, to protests in the Black Lives Matters movement.
So I'd like to, again, thank you for that. A reminder to our audience, at the time of this film, the 1960s, public education was free through the collegiate level, right? So these were students who paid for their books, right? Within a decade, like all of a sudden, tuition started being implemented. You saw student loans. Tuition not only was implemented, but started rising precipitously. There is Ronald Reagan was governor of California at the time. This was something that happens in the California public system. Not coincidentally, Black Studies it's founded as a discipline at San Francisco State. And so we can look at the correlation of that. Out of this struggle happens in 1969. In 1971, you had the founding of a Black Studies Department, of Asian Studies Department, a Puerto Rican Studies Department, and a Women's Studies Department here at and a Jewish Studies Department here at the City College of New York, here at City College. And then that grew throughout the CUNY system. So you have various anniversaries. It immediately, right, at 71, 72, 73 of Africana, what would then become Africana Studies, Puerto Rican / Latino Studies, all of these things throughout the separate colleges. But those are things, you spoke about the pendulum, right, that's happening and that we are living in now. I want to ask for the third clip to be played, and we can talk about watching and living in the pendulum, quite frankly.
Probably the biggest education leap for Black Americans happened at City University, especially immediately after the takeover. And I mean that nationally.
The really great result of open admissions, not only at the City University, but across the country, is that we've changed the story. And the expectation is if you want to go to school, you can go to school and you can succeed.
It is an honor for me to stand in front of you today representing the graduating class. I was born and raised in Yemen, and before migrating with my family to the United States, I couldn't have imagined attending college simply because we weren't allowed to. My sisters weren't allowed to, girls before me weren't allowed to. I fought to be allowed to pursue an education, for the right to be here. As I am sure all of you standing in front of me today fought for the same thing. We earned the right to be here.
When I was a freshman at this school, right, I remember hearing people talk about diversity all the time, but I didn't really understand what it meant. And I absolutely did not understand or appreciate what it's worth. So what I'm telling you is that diversity of people gives rise to diversity of thought. Diversity of people allows us to be a stronger student body, go on to be a stronger workforce, economy, and a stronger nation. And I say to you, esteemed First Lady, you can tell the President that his dreams for our nation have been alive and well at City College for decades and will be for decades to come.
There is a reason why, of all of the colleges and universities in this country, I chose this particular school in this particular city. You represent more than 150 nationalities, just about every possible background, every color and culture, every faith and walk of life. So graduates, with your glorious diversity, you all embody the very purpose of this school's founding.
That's the indication that time is cutting short. And we're going to leave room for questions. But I did want to, isn't it amazing that that was the class of 2016? That was 8 years ago now. And we can talk about a little bit the changes from what we saw. But for those of you who have never been to a City University of New York graduation, that is one of the proudest days on our campus. And we do see, I mean, the vast majority of our students are working class, first gen, many are from immigrant backgrounds, and that is representative of the celebration that happens every year the week of Memorial Day, that Friday of Memorial Day. I invite all of you to just present us with, I don't know, closing remarks or something you want us to take away from this conversation about access and higher education and democracy before we open it up for questions. And anyone can start. Oh, I'm
always happy to talk about democracy here. And let me say something really fast. And then right when Mark was ready. So, a few years ago, or one of the things that I've been studying are the numbers of young people who've been filing suit against their school districts or towns, really alleging a kind of undereducation. Out in Detroit, they were saying, we have no literacy. We're not being taught to read at a level that we're able to actually enact our constitutional rights around civic participation. Here in Providence, there was another thing about civics. Like, y'all are educating us so poorly here in the Providence schools about a decade ago that we are not able to participate in like civics. We don't know anything about civics. Across the country, from getting rid of police in schools to curriculum to demanding anti-racist education, we're in a moment, but it's not getting a lot of notice, I don't think. And I'm not sure that these groups are all hooked up with each other, and that may be why it's not a movement, it's individual actions. But we are, in the past decade, we've seen a real legal challenge on the parts of young people demanding very specific things. The fact that they have to do it at this point makes me incredibly sad. The fact that they are doing it is a glimmer of hope for the future, because there are generations who have, in fact, learned how to fight, how to survive. They're standing on struggles that have taken place before. They know who came before. They know people in their communities who they can turn to. They're asking for support and advice. How do we get educated? How do we become citizens? How do we become humans in this system if we are continually denied certain things? So that actually gives me some hope for democracy, but I wish there was a more robust way to find it, that hope.
Well, I also am tended to be a very positive person, and I like to end on a positive note. But before I do that, let me say that I do think that it is a continual struggle, and in particularly, there is something about the centrality of anti-Black racism in this country that really shapes that pendulum, if you will. And I think in the clip that's shown, and I teach at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, which is a similar institution, and I think we claim to be the second most diverse university in the country, but similar, but our graduation is a similar kind of celebration. There's something about, and I think it was mentioned in the chat, well, 12% of the students are Black at the City College, and 24% of the high school population is Black. I don't know the statistics in New York, but there's something about the celebration of diversity, and our country is getting more diverse, and everybody should have that opportunity to come to the City College or to UMass Boston. But there is an issue of what is really going on in the heart of the education and community and amongst African Americans. And, we mentioned this situation, the education. Those clips of those classrooms can look very similar to today in many places. We just had the case that came out in the paper 2 weeks ago of a 3-year-old Black boy who was taped to his 3-year-old preschool Black boy taped to his chair with duct tape in a preschool classroom in Boston Public Schools. In Brockton Public Schools, they've cut 100 teachers in a predominantly Black school. The students are spending most of their day untaught in a cafeteria. Fights are breaking out, and now there's a call to bring in the National Guard. So I think that we have to face particularly the assaults that's happening in our African American communities, even as we celebrate the broader diversity that's going on. And so I do want to end by, again, lifting up the struggles that are going on. It's not a victimization issue. People are organizing, people are demanding better education, people are demanding a removal of police from schools. There was an outcry against the idea of bringing National Guard in, but we also need the funding of these schools to bring in teachers and to bring in teachers who are culturally relevant and have either come from the community or have experience and knowledge that can connect them to students and families and communities. And I think that if we can have, and that was what was also inspiring about the 5 demands. I'll end on that note, that the folks who are being interviewed, they're graduates of the college and they have gone on to have careers that have not just been about themselves. They have done better, and that's great, but they are also trying to play a role in supporting the development of their community, whether in education or in other kinds of ways. And I think that's part of what happens when people do have access to education, particularly as part of a social movement, as part of a community-based movement, that they learn not just to get ahead for themselves in this society, which is dominantly rewarded, but also to be an advocate and supporter of their community.
Mario.
Yeah, I just want to really, say something in response a little bit to the clip, but also to Mark and the leeway and some of the things that I've been saying. And I think, I would continue to be an evangelist for our historical documentation, archival work, because in this kind of community building archival work, because it's because of the fact that these things do continue to replicate themselves that we need that kind of really important historical perspective on what has happened in the past, right? And how these things are echoed throughout time and history, and how it has been a continual struggle for many of our communities in order to even get this far, right? And the fact that these things continue to happen is indicative of the fact that, like the very sort of fundamentals of white supremacy and sort of entitlements that occur in our societies have not changed that dramatically in many respects, right? Why I was struck by something that the young woman from Yemen said, it's just, we have earned the right to be here. And it feels like we constantly have to make that claim every generation that we've earned the right to be here, yet we continue to be presumed to be incompetent in many respects, right? I think, many of us have sort of experienced this in many settings where the lowered expectations that exist for women and BIPOC communities continue to exist, right? And the sort of depravities continue to exist in many ways. So like, how can then how instrumental is sort of the dissemination of these kinds of films and this kind of histories, indicating, showing to the world that historically, like, your families, your ancestors have continued to struggle for these things, right? And it's really important that you continue to struggle for these things and to sort of go out there and sort of fight for for your education and fight for things to change on your campus so that, we can actually hopefully establish a better world in the future, right? And, this is suffice to say that, obviously one recognizes that certain things have changed in certain respects or in many respects, but I think also the fact that it is a constant struggle in order to stake our claim, right? To stake our claim in education, to stake our claim in society as sort of legitimate individuals who are competent, who are intelligent, who are contributive to society and history, right? And that we have been the entire time. It's just that we've been denied our place in history, right? We have not been allowed to inscribe our histories by the very virtue of, some of our communities have been denied access to literacy, right? And that continues to happen, right? In terms of, thinking about some of Louis' comments and Mark comments about what our classrooms continue to be like, right? A child being duct taped to a chair, like what kind of pedagogical environment is that, right, for someone? And all of sort of the movements in our country right now to not only ban books, but also ban certain historical narratives because they're uncomfortable for certain people, where we have had to learn many, many things that have made us uncomfortable in the classroom, right? That have been inscribed or sort of determined as history or as sort of valid history, as history with a capital H, that those are the histories that we need to know, right? Like, we know a lot about, white histories, like how much have they been sort of obliged to learn about us? And I think that's really, really instrumental as we go forward.
I thank you for that. I do want to say here in New York City, a K through 12 curriculum featuring both Asian American history and African American history, two separate curricula, have only just been funded in the last 2 years, right? And so this continues, right? The continued press, right? And I wish we could put a bow on this conversation and be like, and solve the problems. And the reality is that we know that there are leaky pipelines, right? We know this. The insidiousness of white supremacy and anti-Black racism means that there is a continuing combating of this, as well as, Noliwe, you just spoke about movements not really knowing of each other, right? Or just groups happening across the country, right? And yet this is arguably the easiest, or the moment in which we can most easily connect via social media or emails or the technology we're using at the moment, right? And yet, people still not knowing of each other, when this is perhaps an access to each other is maybe easier. It's not to say that everyone has access to emails or web in general, but this is to say there's a greater moment of accessibility to each other. And so I want to thank my panelists. I want to be very respectful of time. It's 1:59. I do want to say that I was reviewing the chat, and I know that there's a vibrant conversation happening in the chat. I do also want to point out that when we speak about percentages of African-American students, in particular, we can speak about what is happening with working class students and messaging regarding higher education versus messaging regarding going to work, which continues, right? That also happened at the time, right? People saying you don't have to go to college, right? And we have a rise of spaces like Amazon. Many of us have contributed to Jeff Bezos's multi-billion-dollar career, and we also are seeing opportunities where people can work for $20 an hour, and they cannot afford to, they have to make a choice between higher ed and their families, be it the families they're born into or the families that they've brought into this world, right? So the tensions on working class families, higher cost of living in many of our cities, lots of impacts. And so what this film, I think, represents also is a moment, an opportunity, not only for conversation, but a moment of documentation, of saying visually, no, these struggles have been fought and they were won, and we must continue fighting these struggles. So I thank you all this afternoon. Have a beautiful rest of this Wednesday, beautiful week, and take good care, all of you. Thank you.